We have Connor Minielly with Animation Fundamentals for Programmers like you and me, TM.
Okay. Dope. All right. So, quick series of words that aren't necessarily relevant to the talk, but are. Starting with the fact that I was supposed to do this a month ago, and then I was supposed to do it this week, and then I wasn't supposed to do it this week, and then I found out a few hours ago I was. So I wrote this presentation a month. No, it wasn't Zach's fault at all. It was mostly my fault, and a bit Dylan's fault. So we'll see if I remember this or not. At the very least, I definitely remember the demo, so it'll be cool, and this is going to be fun. The name of the talk is obviously Animation Fundamentals for Programmers like you and me, TM. Those of you who have been here for a while know that that is me making fun of Dylan's previous first presentation title, but it also is an accurate description of what I'm talking about today, because I am talking about fundamentally animation. I'm talking about the sort of principles of animation from the traditional world of animation because it's passionately interesting to me. I love this stuff. And it was really interesting to me trying to take that information and bring it into the world of programming and see how it applies to us and the kind of work I do. So like I said, but why though? Why should you listen to me? Why am I talking about this? Because I find it interesting. Don't read all of those. I find it interesting. You might be wondering, are you a front-end developer? Are you an animator? What gives you the credence to say this? And it's nothing at all. I'm not a front-end developer. I like React. I do a lot of React, but mostly I work in Node back-end stuff right now. I just really, really like animation and thought this was interesting. So that's why you should listen to me, because I said so. So on the continuing point of, but why though? Why should you care, not why should you listen to me, are really these things here, or the reasons why I'm doing this. So it's to learn more, as I said, about a discipline I'm passionate about and bring it into my own discipline, and because I find it cool. Again, sorry I forgot the order of these slides, because I'm good at presenting. And at the end, like I said, there is a demo that I'm going to be showing off. So what most of this presentation is going to center around is the good book, the holy book of animation, Disney's The Illusion of Life. Now, this is a book that came out, I believe, sometime in the 70s or something like that. It was written by these two guys here, Frank and Ollie, as they're known. And these two guys are legendary Disney animators. They're some of Disney's, I think they called them the 7 old men, or the 9 old men possibly, and they are the original animators at Disney. And these two guys in particular worked on the people in those pictures there. They worked on The Evil Stepmother, on Captain Hook, on The Stepsisters, on King John. They did iconic pieces of animation and eventually went on to literally write the book. The book that I was just talking about, The Illusion of Life, is that book where they basically laid out the principles of animation that Disney used to become the absolute dreadnought of the animation industry. So these are their 10 principles as they laid them out. Or 12, sorry. These are their 12 principles as they laid them out. In no kind of particular order, an unordered list as you were, except that this one has numbers. We have squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, straight ahead and pose to pose, follow through, slow in, slow out, also known as easing, which is probably the thing we're most familiar with as programmers. The principle of arcs, of secondary action, of timing, exaggeration, solid drawing, and appeal. For those of you who are critical thinkers, like I like to think of myself as, you may realize that that order sucks. It doesn't make any sense. There's no real reason why they show up in that order that I could figure out. So I gave a better one. I tried to assemble things in a way that made sense, grouping principles by what they're relevant to. So the first set of principles I'm going to run through, straight ahead, pose to pose, timing, so in, so out, solid drawing, have to do with the method of animation, the way we go about animating, the actual process of animation. The ones in the middle have to do with the way the animation looks. And finally, the ones at the end I labeled as intent. They have to do with what we want our animations to do. Just to take a moment here again to talk about beyond just the fact that I think it's cool, the reason why we should care about animation as programmers and as anybody is that motion is part of how we communicate. You know, right now I am gesticulating, I am making movements. It's a critical part of how we convey data to other human beings. So when we do a bad job at animation as programmers, as front-end developers, as designers, we're doing a bad job at communication. So that's why I want to go through these so that you can learn how Disney got so good at what they did, like I just did over the past couple weeks and months. And then I'm going to show off some ways that I was able to get close to replicating these principles using just CSS. So the first principle I'm going to talk about is straightforward and pose-to-pose principles. These animations are going to be showing off, these GIFs, which hopefully you're seeing, and the color sucks on this screen, are from the link at the bottom there. A great series of GIF animations to show off all these different principles. When it comes to straightforward and pose-to-pose principles of animation, they're basically talking about the two processes in which traditional animators draw their animations. So straightforward would basically mean I draw a picture, I draw another picture, I draw another picture, and I'm incrementally moving through the motion I'm trying to create. A lot of the times you'll see straightforward animation done for something expressive and spontaneous, like fire or maybe combat even, or things like that. Whereas pose-to-pose, the method would be, and I think I have examples here, where you would have a sort of lead animator, so someone like Frank and Ollie, for example, who would draw the keyframes. That's a phrase we're probably familiar with if you've ever done video editing of any kind. And they would draw the sort of extremes of the motion. So here in black, those are the keyframes. Those are the sort of beginning, the middle, and the end of the action. And then you would fill out sort of halfway between or partway between each of those animations, progressively filling it out until suddenly you get the full flow of the animation. And that's pose to pose, where you go from different poses, literally. Timing. This is one of the few GIFs in this whole set that aren't great at conveying what it's really talking about. When we're talking about timing in animation, we're talking about how long things take. So, for example, dramatic timing. When we're doing a piece of UI or a character's expression, how long does it take them to smile? A quick smile is probably a genuine smile. A slow smile is a little sinister, right? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about timing. We're talking about the expression that the length of time we use gives our animation. Easing is how quick things are to start and stop. So again, this is probably familiar with anyone who's ever done easing animations in CSS, one of the most sort of fundamental things we do in CSS to make it look better. So in this case, you see that there are more frames, there are more little elements of the motion being drawn at the beginning and the end of the motion. And then in the middle, it kind of just moves quickly. There are different types of easings and different sort of mathematical functions that we use to determine those. But in general, easing is a more natural type of motion. And it's very important to making the things we create, you know, in computers look good. Solid drawing, again, is sort of a very procedural element. It's drawing things that look real. One of the reasons why Disney was so successful at animation is because all of their animators started from a skeleton, they drew muscles onto their characters, and then they fleshed out the clothing like it was real fabric, which was something a lot of other companies weren't doing, and a lot of companies still don't do. As far as sort of the world of UI and UX, it's drawing things that don't look unnatural to the user. Material Design did a really good job of this in the early days when they kind of had their idea of paper and having depth to things. So you would have shadows and you would have layers that took up physical space. So that's kind of the sort of thing that solid drawing principle is talking about. Now, sort of onto the way things look when they move. Squash and stretch is the idea that when something moves, it doesn't move as a unified body most of the time. And especially when we want something to look organic and flashy and snappy and cute, we want it to squash and stretch. You'll see a lot of this in the old sort of rubber hose animation, like early Mickey Mouse, all that kind of stuff. They all kind of have like wiggly, wavy arms, and they're very silly. But even in UI elements, a lot of the time, if you click on something and it kind of has a bounce and it sort of will wiggle as you move it, that's squash and stretch at work. A very important thing about squash and stretch is that it still should be physically accurate. So if something, it's squash and stretch, not squash or stretch. It should maintain its volume, which is a rule we break all the time in computers and fake animation that makes stuff look really weird. Anticipation is another thing that is very, very useful for our sorts of animations that we need to do to convey information to users, is that something should sort of subtly let people know that it's going to move before it does, because very few motions in reality are instantaneous. So in this case, anticipation is rocking back and forth before you flip over. The one pitfall we have to avoid, obviously, is we don't want things to be laggy or sluggish. Follow through is kind of building on the previous two, that when something moves, it doesn't just stop moving. That's not the way physics works. Unless there's something stopping it from moving, there's always a follow-through motion, and the same thing should be true of our animations as programmers. Secondary action is maybe not as commonly used in UI and that kind of stuff, but it's the idea that good animation has more than one thing going on. It has a secondary interesting piece of information or flair. And it's a really easy way. You see this in like a lot of logo designs and stuff, that the logo doesn't just appear. The logo appears at the same time that color fills out and that gradients change and that kind of stuff, which is somewhat essentially secondary action to make it more interesting. Arcs is another sort of very based on nature type of principle of animation, that there aren't a lot of linear movements in nature that aren't in some way involving arcs. So even the hinge of my arm here, when I try to move it in a straight line, is actually an arc radiating out from my elbow. It's just that my elbow is moving in sync with my hand, so it looks like a straight motion, but it's not. So when we do motion, we should try as often as possible, as often as isn't crowded, to move in arcs or some kind of curvaceous movement. And exaggeration obviously is the idea that it's cool when you see things pop and grow and spring and move in interesting ways, and that if we just do purely realistic animation, we do boring animation, and it's not very interesting for people. Staging, and these are kind of the last two sort of more ethereal concepts, more ethereal principles of animation, and you can tell that this one is kind of a little awed by how simple this particular GIF is. Staging is just the framing of the animation itself. So, for us in the programming world, in the tech world, staging is the app and the UI that the animation lives in. It's the context in which our animation takes place, and it needs to be relevant to the animation, and they need to flow well together and present each other in equal measure. And finally, appeal, which is just that sort of je ne sais quoi. It's the little bit of heart and flair and the rough edges and the very smoothed out edges that make something unique and interesting. And that is kind of that, as far as Disney was concerned, it was that thing that was quintessentially Disney. Now, neat, cool, very cool, right? We've learned some things about animation. I've talked about computers throughout, but whatever. You can't do any of that with CSS, you big fat liar. And when I started this, I would have said you're right. Those cubes move very well. It's hard to make things move in CSS, at least for someone who doesn't do it every day of their lives. But I said, fuck it, I'll try it. So, I created a React app because, that seemed like a good idea at the time. And it turned out to be a good idea because I was able to create this little guy over here, my kind of sort of interesting cube component here. And basically what this cube does is it creates a whole bunch of different styled divs using styled components, and it passes some props in and sets some defaults and does a whole bunch of stuff that probably could be done better, but this is how I did it. and it creates a cube. So that cube, surprisingly, came to life more easily than I thought it would. And there it is. So we have a cube, which hopefully you can all see, that is pure CSS. It's just divs with colors that are moving in three-dimensional space because, by the way, CSS lets us do that all the time for anything. You can move it in three-dimensional space. So, cool. That's pretty neat, but what can the cube do? How can I apply these animation principles to it? How close can I get to those really nice GIFs that we had going on there? Well, I got it squashing and stretching. That was pretty hard. So our litmus test here, what this is comparing against, was this guy here. So he's doing his little bounce, he's doing his turn, he's squashing and stretching. I couldn't get that secondary action happening of the little lines and flashes, but the actual sort of movement itself, actually a bit smoother than it is in the GIF there, was not too bad. And all of that is coming from this guy right here. So this chunk of keyframed CSS from 0 to 100% of the animation taking course over 1.2 seconds is that motion. Yeah? That's not doing, that was the wrong button. Sorry, I'm using my terrible trackpad. There it is. All right, cool. So there's a couple different things going on that'll be used in the one other animation I was able to get working in the time that I had. That are going on here. So we have our sort of Z, Y translations, the things that are actually relevant to the motion. You can see I'm setting an easing function here, which is a cubic Bezier for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing. And I'm actually manipulating the scale of it along the way. And this particular animation I basically felt out step by step as much as possible because it was really hard to do it sort of more mathematically and scientifically and have all the easing and everything happen. So that's why there's so many steps here. But it would be possible, presumably, to achieve the same result in probably less incremental fashion. But again, this is like 30, 40 lines of CSS, which is really just the same line over and over again with minor changes, and we're able to get something as expressive and squishy and squashy as this little bouncing cube, which isn't perfect. It doesn't really show off anticipation very well. It doesn't show off a bunch of the other presentation principles very well, but he does squash and stretch. So what's next? What else can he do? Well, right now he can only do one other thing. Hopefully in time he'll be able to do everything. But right now he can show off some anticipation. He can do his little rock and his little roll, and when he flips over onto his side, he does a little jiggle because, follow through like we learned about before. He's not an expert in his cartwheels. You can kind of see if there was a ground there, he'd be clipping through it. That was because of the way the 3D rotations were working. It's actually anchoring the rotations around the panel that's in the background. So it kind of creates a little interesting effect where he sort of slides around a little bit. You can see over here what I had to do to get that one happening was I actually had to manipulate the transform origin, which again, who knew you could do that? I didn't until I started doing this, but you can actually change, and through the course of an animation, you can change your origin of transformation. So at the beginning, it starts at the bottom right. So he kind of rocks on his side at the bottom right, and then it switches to his bottom left, and he rocks up, and it switches back, and he rocks this way, and then eventually he flips over onto his side, and then slides back into the center, and it all starts all over again. And that, again, takes course through a few dozen lines of very simple CSS, just sort of repeated with some of the numbers changed. So it's kind of amazing how relatively easy once you know what you're looking for. It is to start meeting these traditional requirements of expressive, good animation. And maybe some point we can look at ourselves as programmers and say that we are, the Walt Disney of animated UIs. Hopefully not also of racism. That's all I have so far. Woo! Don't fall. Any questions? Yeah. I shouldn't have unplugged that already.
Where did we get started learning all of this? This seems like, I've been doing CSS for like 7 years. I've never seen anything like this before.
I'm going to plug this back in real quick. Sorry, there we go. We're going to see if that comes back. All right, so the question was, where would you get started learning something like this? One of the answers to that question is CSS Tricks, which is a site a lot of us have run into before, is one of the few sites that I find regularly delves into some of the more advanced capabilities of CSS. Even something like the MDM or that other one that we go to all the time as web developers that I'm drawing a blank on, W3 School. Oftentimes they miss some of the complexity that CSS is capable of. A lot of this is something you have to try to do to see it work. So something like this particular quirk here of that little three-dimensional skew that's happening, that little jiggle, I couldn't actually find another example of anybody doing that, of skewing a pseudo three-dimensional object in CSS and it working. I don't know if that's something that just recently became possible and no one's really talking about it or what. It was something I just tried because I wanted to see if it would work, and it did. So one of the answers is experimentation. The other answer is CSS Tricks, and the other answer for the actual fundamentals of animation themselves, which encourage us to try these kinds of more complex things, is the Illusion of Life itself, the book by Frank and Ollie, is amazing. The Animator Survival Kit, who I can't remember the name of the guy. It's the dude who was the animation director on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Fucking legendary. Richard Williams. That's a fantastic book. And this video here is kind of what inspired me to start this whole process. It's kind of a short, I think 10-minute-ish sort of, what do you call those? Video essays on this kind of whole history and the principles of animation and stuff, and it's fucking phenomenal. It's super well edited, it's really nice and concise, and does a much better job of explaining the principles of animation than I did here. So those are a few places to start if you're interested. And I found React was really good for this because I was able to do some kind of CSS and JS stuff and reuse components and all that kind of stuff. So if you already know that ecosystem, it's a great place to start playing around. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. That's it for me.